Hello friends, Matt here with Jonah Kirkwiescott. Today, this video is actually an assignment that I'm completing for a master's class. I'm working on a Master of Arts in Philosophy, and this class is Logic and Epistemology. And so, this video is about the epistemology of St. Thomas Aquinas. It's important to note, first of all, that modern epistemology has been dedicated since the time of Descartes to figuring out how we can guarantee that we have knowledge about the outside world. Descartes questioned whether or not we actually experience the outside world or if we only experience our own perceptions. And that's what modern epistemology has been dealing with since the time of Descartes. And of course, Descartes comes after Thomas Aquinas. And so these questions about guaranteeing our access to outside reality is never a question that Thomas Aquinas ever dealt with. And so it would be anachronistic, it would be unjust to demand of Thomas Aquinas that he answer directly questions that were never asked during his time. There's another danger here in trying to do Thomistic epistemology, because we want our answers to come from Thomas Aquinas. Thomism should come from Thomas Aquinas, and not even just working with his principles, because there's always the chance that we're going to misapply the principles and do that in a way that Thomas Aquinas himself wouldn't have done. And so if we find answers in Thomas Aquinas, they have to come from Thomas Aquinas. But what we can do is we can trace an outline of how Thomas Aquinas said that we know, and then see if, as he's tracing that out, he gives us an answer to this question that modern epistemologists have been asking. And so, to begin with, what we have to do is figure out, what does it mean for Thomas Aquinas to say that we know? What is it to know, right? What's knowing according to St. Thomas Aquinas? And then we will see that if somewhere in that process of knowing, he answers the question that we're trying to ask. A long story made short, Thomas Aquinas basically says that in order for us to know something, we reproduce that thing in our intellect. And so the thing that's outside of us is actually, we have that thing itself, in our intellect by way of representation. And so how does this begin? First of all, it begins with the senses. All knowledge begins with the senses. And there's a famous phrase that says, nihil in intellectu quod non prius in sensu, which is Latin, and it means there's nothing in the intellect that was not first in the senses. And so what happens first is some sensible object, some object that we can sense, acts on our senses, right? Like we see a flower, or we see a table, or something like that. And then in the imagination, an image of that object is produced. And the imagination is called the imagination because it's like image nation, right? Imagination. So an image of whatever's outside of us is produced in the imagination. And that image that's produced in the imagination, we sometimes call that a phantasm. Sometimes people hear phantasm, they think we're talking about like a ghost or a phantom or something like that. No, phantasm just means the sensible image that's produced, right? And the imagination is what we're talking about when we tell you to picture something in your mind. Like if I ask you to picture a triangle, right? Or to picture your bed, you can produce an image of that. And the place where you do that is the imagination. That's the power of the imagination that we have. Sometimes we use imagination to mean creativity. Somebody has a big imagination. But in Thomas Aquinas, the imagination is the place where we reproduce sense images. And it's important to note that these phantasms, or the images in the imagination, can only be of particular objects. So if I picture a bed, what usually happens is I picture a particular bed, right? Like it's a certain color and it's a certain size. And then I can picture a different bed, but that's a different particular bed, right? If I'm asked to remember my bed, then it's that particular singular individual bed that I think of. And even with like the example we're seeing now, flowers. If I think of flower, I try to imagine a flower, I can't produce an image of flower in general. Instead, what tends to happen is that I get a flurry of images of individual flowers. And then I think of that as like, oh, that's what flower is. But really all I'm doing is I'm replaying in my mind a lot of different images of flowers that I've seen or that I've invented. And so it's important to realize that the imagination can only support particular things, not things in general. I can't picture flower in general. So this flower in general we call the essence of the flower, or the idea of flower. is not a single image. It's not something that we can picture. And so at this point, what we really have is only the most basic form of knowledge. It's this sense image that's been reproduced in the imagination. It's an image that represents some particular object. And to be clear, what Thomas Aquinas is talking about here is not that we know the image in our minds. Rather, the image is itself the means by which we know the other thing. So I know the flower by means of the image that it is in my mind. It's not the case that I know only the image in my mind. The image is the reproduction of the thing itself. And that's how I know the thing, is through the image. What happens next is that the intellect abstracts the essence or the idea from the phantasm. Frederick Copleston, a historian of philosophy, says that the intellect illumines the phantasm and abstracts the general idea. Right? General meaning it refers to the genus or the whole group of the things, not just to one particular thing itself. And so this is also sometimes called a universal, because it's one that many. It's one idea that applies to many things, as opposed to the image, the phantasm in the imagination, which is one particular thing. The universal or the general idea is one thing in the mind that applies to many others. And that's the work of the intellect, is that it takes from the sense images, from the phantasms, and pulls from them the essence or the idea of that thing. And Thomas Aquinas says that the intellect becomes that thing. And once again, Thomas Aquinas is clear on this, that it's not that we know our own ideas. Rather, it's by way of representation, the thing is what the intellect becomes, and that is how we know the thing. Right? So instead of knowing our ideas, we know things by means of our ideas, by means of these essences that we've abstracted. This is one of the big mistakes in modern philosophy, to think that our ideas are what we know rather than that by which we know. Right? We don't know an idea. Instead, what we know is something through an idea. We know the idea of something, not just a plain idea itself. And so when we have the essence or the concept or the general idea or the universal of, for example, a flower, that essence, the universal, doesn't cease to be the flower, and at the same time, our intellect does not cease to be the intellect. Right? If I were to take a hunk of metal and I made it into a flower, then I made it into something else, it would be changing the thing that it is. The intellect, its special property, is that it can become something else and yet still be the intellect. I would try to give some other type of illustration, but it would be misleading because an illustration or an image for this would lead us astray. There is no image. We don't have an image or a phantasm of what flower in general looks like. Right? It's imageless because it's not a particular thing. It's one essence, one universal that applies to many things, to all the flowers that are out there. And so the concept is general, but the image, the phantasm in the imagination, is particular. And that's why the concept can apply to many individuals. And the intellect does this job. It abstracts the general idea automatically and without error. Whatever the senses present to the imagination forms and reproduces whatever is there, and then the intellect automatically abstracts the essence. And we don't have to think about it. It's not a process that we have to work on and kind of pick out individually the aspects of the thing. Later on, we might be able to do something like that. If we try to form a definition, then we have to think through the examples that we've seen. We have to think about the essence, right? And that's a complex process. But just the formation of the essence itself, the formation of the general concept, is something that the intellect does automatically. It's the nature of the intellect to do that, and it does it without error. Over time, this concept can be refined, right? Like, for example, if a child sees something furry in the yard, he might call it a dog, and then every furry thing he calls dog. But then over time, with experience and communication with other people, that idea, that concept gets refined, right? And then maybe he becomes a veterinarian later on, and that even gets even further refined as he learns more and more about, what the insides of a dog and how a dog works and all that kind of thing. So the concepts and the essences start off general, and then they get more particular as we experience the world more. Again, it's got to come through the senses first, then we're able to abstract it into the intellect, and those ideas get refined. And so what we get then is truth or falsehood based on judgments. The intellect abstracting the idea, that's not true or false. What is true or false is a statement, like, for example, this book is large, or that is not a bear. What we're doing is we're combining or dividing these essences, or we're combining essences with a particular. And this is where truth or falsehood comes in, is in seeing things and making judgments about them. And so a judgment is either a division of a concept or it's a combination of two concepts. So if I say this is a large book, I'm associating the concepts of book and large, or if I say this is not a bear, I'm separating this thing from the idea of a bear. And so error really doesn't take place in forming the concept, it takes place in making judgments. And so if we look back over what we've learned about Thomas Aquinas and then think about how that relates to the question that modern epistemologists are asking, we see that truth is possible because we are putting in our minds the thing itself by way of representation. So it's not so much like, do we have access to those things or not? Instead, what we have is the intellect itself becomes the thing that we are looking at. There is an automatic correspondence between the thing itself and the thing itself as it exists in us. And that's how we know things. And so even though Thomas Aquinas didn't answer these questions directly, we can see that just by examining the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas and how we know things according to his philosophy, we can answer some of these questions that modern epistemologists have asked, and something that epistemology has been struggling with ever since the time of Descartes. If we go back to Thomas Aquinas, then there are commonsensical answers that make perfect sense of the situation. So thanks for watching. I hope this video was instructive. Please subscribe, share with your friends.